death behind bars. Corruption, violence, and the tragic killing of a young woman inside a Georgia prison. How a corrupt system turned a jail sentence into a death sentence. On a humid summer morning in June 2024, Smith State Prison in Glennville, Georgia, became the site of a chilling tragedy that exposed the deep rot within the state's prison system. Place designed to house the guilty had become a death trap for the innocent. Inside the prison's industrial kitchen, 24-year-old Aureon Shavea Grace was finishing her morning shift. She wasn't a corrections officer, just a food service worker employed by Aramark, a private company contracted to provide meals to inmates. She had taken the job to support her 2 young children while pursuing a nursing career. But that day, her dreams and her life were violently cut short. The shot that shook Georgia's prison system. As she turned to grab a tray, a gunshot rang out, shattering the routine chaos of prison life. Before anyone could react, Jedrika's heart, a convicted killer serving a 20-year sentence for voluntary manslaughter, stood over her lifeless body. The gun was still in his hand. Then, he turned the weapon on himself. The question that sent shockwaves through the nation was simple. How did an inmate get a gun inside a maximum security prison? A prison in chaos. The role of a corrupt warden. The answer lay within the walls of Smith State Prison, a facility notorious for corruption, gang activity, and unchecked violence. Under the leadership of Warden Brian Adams, staff shortages and security failures had turned the prison into a lawless territory controlled more by criminals than officers. Contraband weapons, drugs, and cell phones flooded in through drone drops, staff bribes, and unsecured delivery points. The warden, despite numerous warnings, had failed to address the glaring security lapses, allowing inmates to run a criminal network from within the prison walls. Former guards spoke out about Adams' alleged ties to gang leaders inside the prison. One former corrections officer, speaking anonymously, described the environment as a war zone, where understaffed officers either looked the other way or got out before they became the next victim. A system on the brink, staff shortages, gangs, and no way out. Smith State Prison had long been in crisis. In October 2023, Correctional Officer Robert Clark was stabbed to death by an inmate wielding a homemade weapon. Another casualty of a failing system. Staffing levels were so low that gang leaders filled the power vacuum, enforcing their own rules and running illicit businesses from inside their cells. And investigators began digging into Hart's access to a firearm. One theory stood out. It was smuggled in by a corrupt officer or staff member. Smith State Prison had no functioning metal detectors at key entry points, making it easy for weapons to slip through the cracks. This wasn't just an isolated incident, said a former Georgia Department of Corrections (GDC) investigator. This was years of corruption and negligence finally coming to a head. A mother's grief, a system's failure. For Aureon's mother, Tiffany Grace, the horror of her daughter's murder was worsened by the fact that it was entirely preventable. They failed to protect her, she said in a tearful interview. She wasn't an inmate, she was just doing her job. Now, my grandchildren have no mother. Her grief turned to anger as reports surfaced of the prison's repeated failure to prevent contraband smuggling. The Justice Department steps in, following this and other high-profile, violent incidents. The U.S. Department of Justice launched a full-scale investigation into Georgia's prison system. The findings were damning. Massive corruption at the highest levels. Guards and officials accepting bribes to smuggle in weapons and drugs. Severe understaffing, leading to unchecked gang control. Record high inmate homicide rates. Federal officials declared Georgia's prison system was deliberately indifferent to the safety of its staff and inmates. A lawsuit loomed, threatening to place the entire state's Department of Corrections under federal oversight, a system in need of reform or collapse. Governor Brian Kemp responded with a $600 million emergency funding package aimed at staffing increases, security upgrades, and infrastructure repairs. But for those inside the system, the damage was already done. For the inmates, a jail sentence in Georgia had become a death sentence. For the families of victims like Aureon Grace, justice would never truly be served, and for the corrupt officials who had profited from the suffering of those behind bars, the reckoning was only beginning.